So decolonizing history very broadly is about questioning which people and places are at the center of the study of the past, and also asking questions about why.
To me, a big part of decolonizing is about unlearning deeply held attitudes regarding who we deem to be a figure of authority and questioning why.
So decolonization, I take to be a project of undoing the political, economic, cultural, and ideological manifestations of colonial power.
Much is at stake in this moment, and it is critical to reevaluate what it is we teach, why we teach it, and how we teach it, and to consider who we honor as holding authority, both in the public space and the space of knowledge.
There are so many new books on these issues of going back earlier to think about what could have happened or what steps haven't been taken is quite interesting, because we want to see that there are lost futures. There were hopes to remake the world.
There is a kind of effort to remember the empire as some kind of neutral globalizing thing that's all it was. It just brought progress, and where it failed, that was just an anomaly. That wasn't an integral part of the process through which dispossessions and erasures and all of that was created. There's definitely a need to address this idea of imperial nostalgia in the West, and equally of this kind of idea of a return to a putative pre-colonial purity in the non-West.
Americans are selective romantics, and Americans like romance more than they like truth. And these objects serve as romance of these mythologies of what Native Americans are.
From an Indigenous perspective, the whole thing is connected to land. And I would just say the whole restorative history project, if you like, as Brother Malcolm X said, if you have no past, you have no future. And that is the driver for us.
What I'm concerned about and I'm interested in is how healthcare gets proffered as a means to maintain those colonial relations of power. But one thing that really comes to the fore in my research that I think parallels with contemporary things we're saying now in terms of vaccine equity is this concern over trust and consent. So who is trusted to provide care and who is trusted to speak competently about their own body. So in my work and those of others who are working in this period of time, we see how colonial attitudes that are shaped by assumptions about race, gender, sexuality, ability, all of these are framing who is allowed to consent and who can refuse medical interventions.
The essential piece of creating our own narratives is really to combat erasure. Because if we don't center our own narratives, if we don't tell our own stories, then what happens is others will tell our stories for us, and we'll get left out, and our own contributions will get left out.
We continue to fight for St. Peter Claver because as African Americans, there are so few things that we have because our heritage has been lost due to slavery. But what we do have is this church in Philadelphia that our ancestors established.
Racism is this country's underlying pre-existing condition. And again, how we frame the narrative around racial inequities, how we quote unquote decolonize that narrative is so critical because it not only helps us to understand these inequities, but also to address them.
I keep thinking, why are we still arguing this? Why do we still have to arguing for that Black Lives Matter? And I'm thinking about the legacy it has in early museum work and anthropology work and the race science that happened in museums, such as the Penn Museum and the American Museum of Natural History, and thinking about the residues of that in museums today and the larger cultural matrix of which they are part. And how do we reconcile these deeply entrenched pseudoscientific ideas about how Black lives do not indeed matter?
Nothing was written about the women. Nothing. There was nothing in the books about the women. And if there was, it wasn't recognized as women's work. It was recognized as Sioux. or Apache or something like that. And the agency of those women was completely removed out of the collecting of those objects. We said, yeah, about 85% of the objects currently shown at the Chicago Art Institute are made by women. And there's no markers on any of them indicating that they're made by women.
I come through a school system where we were written out of it. We were not only erased from the historical page, but erased from the landscape. And it's partly driven to write us back in to that landscape, and particularly for our young people coming through, to know that they had heroes and heroines, across the past 230 odd years who fought against colonialism and continue to fight to this very day for Aboriginal rights to land and for our people.
So I think as an early Americanist, one of the things that I think is happening and that I've been very excited to see in and around Philadelphia is that beyond just the celebration of early America and William Penn and Benjamin Franklin and our kind of icons of early American history, there's increasingly attention to this Indigenous history and this Indigenous persistence in Pennsylvania. And I think that that's a really significant change and something that's really important for framing how we think about, the city, because I don't know that anyone would have thought of it as Lenape country maybe 20 or 30 years ago, even who wasn't Native.
We're asking museums which are monuments to empire to not be that, and I don't know if we can do that. And so when I think about museums and the rise of museums, at least in the US, they absolutely coincide with post-Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, this huge stratification, violent stratification of race.
I think history is just a huge, kind of natural past time capsule lab to find that material where you can kind of craft either different theories or different narratives and explanations that go beyond just tables, descriptive tables of the X has this much and Y has that much disease. So I've always in COVID, it's no different in COVID. Even though COVID has only been with us for a year, you can still bring in the history of institutions that in the U.S. case certainly failed big time, and figure out why. You can talk about why some of the determinants of who gets COVID and who doesn't are there in the first place. So there are all sorts of historical questions that I think we should be introducing the COVID debate, and we haven't.
What do we do? For some people in the museum sector, this is all about rewriting the labels. Everything's going to be okay if we can just really, better, really more honestly, simply maintain things as they are, and just, it's all about words. And of course, that's an incredibly, dangerous argument.
For me, and for those of us within this disciplinary space who have committed ourselves to the work of decolonizing, it should be stressed that the work of decolonizing, for reasons that Kutcha has brought out already, is not, cannot, never could be about accumulating persons from groups historically underrepresented at predominantly white institutions for show and tell. It is about interrogating and in many cases demolishing long-standing hierarchies and building back up to a knowledge practice and way of inhabiting forms of knowledge that is not just flexible, capacious, and equitable, but redistributed.
I think the work of doing Indigenous history too it's important that we allow ourselves to have history, right? And and by what I mean by that is, to have space to turn into our own internal dynamics, our own conversations and arguments and disagreements, and the possibilities of restorative history, right? As you put it, I think part of that is allowing us to have a full and complicated history. It's important for us to have a sense of our history inside that struggle, not just the external history, right? To the outside actor.
Newspapers and things have tried to cover our situation, and one of the things that they say that we've been said, you're black and you're Catholic, why don't you just go somewhere else? However, that is our church, We have been loyal to the Archdiocese of Philadelphia for all these years. We are supposed to be where we are. We will remain where we are. We will continue to protest as long as these situations happen.
The nature of museum itself has changed over the last let's say 25, 30 years. It exists in the digital realm, and as a result, the conversations that used to be had in the museum, which is based, as you say, on the idea of sort of imperial plunder, are now in the public realm and are available for us to talk about, discuss, and think of how they can be decolonized.
What we need to do is to foreground and listen to and act upon the voices that have been calling for physical dismantling. You know, there's a lot to do. We cannot allow, though, these changes to wait until we have also diversified. It's all going to happen at once. But we also need to recognise that these are war zones. These are and therefore they have to turn into sites of conscience and sites of memory, and in part sites for facing up to all of the loss that came with empire.
The development of these vaccines is absolutely extraordinary. It's a real tribute to what you can do when states put their mind to it. So that's wonderful, that's great news. However, 87% of vaccinations have already happened in only 12 countries of the world, who represent 14% of the population. There are billions who have not got vaccines. People are dying because of this. And I feel that if more people knew about it, they would not allow such an appalling state of affairs to continue.
What happens to me a lot lately is that people want me to come and tell them about decolonization in like a nice way that also tells them that decolonization is going to be easy, but also kind of approaches them as if decolonization is an option. And it's not an option anymore, because we're not going to solve the problems that we have in this world with capitalism and settler colonialism. That's what created these problems. We're only going to solve the problems and move forward through decolonization. So now is the time that we have to stand up.